The door to the boardroom slammed so hard the glass walls trembled. Every head turned as Richard Blackwell strode in, his tailored suit straining against the fury in his shoulders. He didn't bother with greetings. His voice cut through the air like a blade. "Your 12-person team are fraudsters." The words ricocheted around the conference table. My stomach dropped before I could even process what he was holding. Richard slammed a leather folder onto the table, its papers fanning out to reveal one number circled in thick red ink, 23. The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt every eye pivot toward me, as if there were some unspoken consensus that the quiet woman with the spreadsheets must be the guilty one. My throat closed, heat rising up my neck. I had never missed a deadline, never submitted an inaccurate report, never once walked out of this building before the lights dimmed at midnight, and yet here I was, branded a criminal. Richard's glare locked on me with surgical precision. "I've already contacted the police," he said, his voice dropping into that cold register powerful men use when they want to remind you how powerless you are. "They're on their way to arrest you." "Vivian," gasps rippled across the table. A chair screeched as someone instinctively pushed away from me. I could feel the room recoiling. Colleagues I'd eaten lunch with shrinking from my presence as though guilt might be contagious. My chest constricted. Images flooded in without permission, logging expense reports on Christmas Eve, canceling a weekend with friends to reconcile client accounts, sitting alone in this very building the week of my mother's funeral because Richard had said, "We need you." 4 years of sacrifice erased in one pronouncement. Richard smirked. He leaned his fists against the table and let the venom drip slowly. "It's always the quiet ones." The words hung there, a public execution carried out with nothing but his authority and a red circle on a spreadsheet. My pulse hammered in my ears as I searched for air. The people I had broken my back to support now looked at me as if they'd never known me at all. And that was the moment I understood silence would not save me now. The silence in the room was worse than Richard's accusation. It was the way my colleagues' eyes cut through me, suspicion hardening into something sharper. Devin Rourke leaned back in his chair, his tie perpetually loose, a smirk ghosting his lips like he'd known this was coming. Amara Velasquez shifted uncomfortably, cradling the water bottle she always carried since coming back from maternity leave, her expression torn between sympathy and fear. Terrence Bloom, brilliant but awkward, blinked down at his laptop screen, fingers twitching as if he wanted to run a diagnostic on the numbers right then and there, but lacked the courage to speak. Lucia Moreno, the office manager who seemed to know every secret whispered in these halls, pressed her lips together, studying me as if weighing truth against survival. And Dominic Hale, our team lead, sat too still, his jaw clenched in a way that told me more than words ever could. He'd always resented me for catching the mistakes he let slide. Now he had the perfect opportunity to watch me fall. Richard paced at the head of the table, feeding their doubts like oxygen to fire. For 8 months, these irregularities have been happening, he said, tapping the folder for emphasis. 8 months since Vivian Hartman joined this division. Clever, almost invisible discrepancies until my auditors uncovered the pattern. The room shifted. I could feel the distance stretching wider between me and the rest of them, like invisible lines being drawn across the table. 8 months. My chest tightened. That was exactly when Richard had called me into his office, his voice warm with manufactured respect. "Vivian, I need someone meticulous, someone I can trust. Special projects requires the best." I had walked out of that meeting glowing, convinced I had finally been recognized for my hard work. Now the memory soured like spoiled milk. What if that invitation hadn't been recognition at all? What if it had been the first step in this carefully laid trap I swallowed hard? The back of my throat raw. If I pleaded my innocence, it would sound like desperation. If I stayed silent, his story would calcify into truth. Either way, Richard had written me into the role of scapegoat, and the others were already nodding along to his script. The trap had been set the day I accepted that so-called promotion. The moment Richard said 8 months, my mind spun backward, unspooling to that afternoon in his office. I could see it as if I were standing there again. The 32nd floor, glass walls gleaming with the skyline behind him, the city stretched out like a trophy. Richard sat in his leather chair, the kind that looked too expensive to be functional, and gestured for me to take a seat opposite. His smile had been almost disarming, warm enough to make me believe it. "You're the detail person," he'd said, voice dipped in flattery. "I need you on my most sensitive accounts." I remember the rush of pride that filled me, finally, after years of being the invisible one who corrected everyone's errors and stayed late to reconcile the ledgers. I thought someone had noticed. I had walked out of his office feeling taller, convinced my work had finally been recognized. But sitting here now, the bitter truth came crashing down. The fraud trail hadn't just started sometime after I arrived. It had started that exact week. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. He hadn't promoted me, he'd positioned me. I wasn't chosen because I was trustworthy. I was chosen because I was expendable, at the edge of my vision. Dominic leaned closer to Richard and whispered something. Richard didn't even blink. He simply nodded once. Subtle, but deliberate. The quiet confirmation struck me harder than any accusation. Dominic had been close enough to see everything. Had he known all along? Had he been part of it from the start? My hands trembled beneath the table, hidden by the polished wood. I pressed my palms flat against my skirt to still them, but the shaking wouldn't stop. And in that trembling, I heard my father's voice, clear as the day he died at his modest desk in our small-town home. "Numbers don't lie, Vivian. People do. Never forget the difference." The memory steadied me, but it also deepened the ache in my chest. He'd taught me to believe that honesty and hard work were shields. Now those very qualities had painted a target on my back. I forced myself to meet Richard's stare, but all I could see was the trap snapping shut. Richard prowled the length of the table like a predator circling its prey. His voice cut through the whispers. "Check her computer. Already done, and we found plenty." The words slammed into me harder than his initial accusation. My heart lurched, then dropped with the clarity of it. Evidence didn't just appear on its own. They had planted it, carefully, meticulously, just enough to make the narrative believable. Across the table, Dominic's lips curled in the faintest smirk. So slight most would have missed it, but I caught it. He knew. He'd either helped or at least watched it unfold, and now he relished seeing me cornered. A murmur rippled around the room. Devin leaned toward Amara, whispering too loudly. I knew something was off. Amara shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away from mine. Terrence hunched deeper into his seat, staring at his hands as though willing himself invisible. Only Lucia met my gaze steady. Unreadable, her silence both unnerving and strangely grounding. The heat in my chest swelled until it was almost unbearable. Fear had been pressing against my ribs since Richard stormed in, but now it ignited into something sharper. Rage, raw and undeniable. I had spent years living small, following rules, staying invisible because I believed integrity was enough. Yet here I was, one breath away from being marched out in handcuffs for crimes I hadn't committed. If I let them write this story for me, I would never escape it. I straightened slowly, forcing my trembling hands to fold neatly on the table. Richard's eyes flicked to the movement, narrowing with suspicion. He thought he had already won, that I was moments from breaking down. He didn't know I'd been preparing for this silently, carefully, for months. Every altered invoice I had archived, every suspicious request I had documented, every instruction I had obeyed but recorded anyway, it was all there, hidden away where they couldn't touch it. Not paranoia, not overthinking, proof. For the first time since the nightmare began, my breath steadied. My father's words pulsed through me again. Numbers don't lie. People do. I lifted my eyes to Richard's, and the fear slipped from my voice. Then maybe, I said evenly, you'll want to see what I've found. I rose to my feet before I could second-guess myself. My legs steadied under me, firmer than I expected, as if the decision alone had given me balance. I reached into my blazer and pulled out my phone. The room fell into a hush, every whisper silenced by the small, deliberate movement. I said, my voice even, you'll want to see this. Richard's mouth twisted into a sneer, a confession. How thoughtful. Not exactly. My thumb tapped the screen, and the folder I'd been curating for 10 long months opened. Screenshots, transaction logs, time-stamped backups, even audio recordings of Richard himself instructing me to adjust billing lines. I slid the phone across the polished table until it stopped at his hands. He glanced down, casual at first, but his composure cracked almost instantly. His eyes scanned the screen once, twice, and then widened in disbelief. Color drained from his face as the audio played in sharp, undeniable clarity. Don't worry about the discrepancy. Vivian. Move the numbers. We'll balance it later. Gasps rippled around the table. Amara's hand flew to her mouth. Devin leaned forward, eyes darting between Richard and me. Terrence froze, fingers rigid against his laptop. Even Dominic, who had smirked moments earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The balance of power shifted in real time, and they all felt it. Richard slammed the phone shut with a trembling hand. You violated confidentiality. You had no right. I didn't let him finish. Illinois is a one-party consent state. I said calm as stone. I didn't need your permission. And everything you just saw is backed up in 3 secure locations, including my attorney's office. So if you're thinking of making this disappear, don't. The silence that followed was no longer suffocating. It was heavy with the weight of revelation. For the first time, Richard's authority faltered. His gaze darted across the room, looking for allies, but none of them moved. I sat back down slowly, reclaiming my seat as though nothing had happened, though my pulse thundered in my ears. For years, I'd been the quiet one in the room. Now, the quiet belonged to me. Richard's knuckles whitened against the table as he straightened his tie, his mask of control slipping with every breath. Richard snapped upright, clutching the edges of the table as though he could still anchor himself to power. Everyone out, he barked, his voice low but venomous. Now, for a heartbeat. No one moved. Then Dominic Hale, ever the eager lieutenant, pushed his chair back. The scrape echoed through the silence. He stood halfway to the door before stopping, his shoulders tight, his fists flexing. I can't, he said finally, turning back toward Richard. His voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. You told me to push approvals through. You said Vivian would catch anything important. You said she'd cover it. My chest constricted. His words cut sharper than Richard's accusations ever had. So it hadn't just been carelessness. Dominic had known. He had carried out the instructions, trusting I would be the shield when the trap closed. The room erupted in low gasps and murmurs. Devin muttered something under his breath. Amara leaned forward, her eyes wide, staring at me as though piecing together the real story for the first time. Terrence shook his head slowly, disbelief clouding his face. Lucia stayed still, her gaze flicking between us, calculating every word. Richard's face blanched. "Shut your mouth, Dominic," he hissed. But the damage was done. The shift was palpable. No longer was I the lone accused. The cracks in his fortress had begun to show, and everyone could see them. A sharp buzz broke the tension. Richard glanced at his phone, and in that instant, his composure cracked completely. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened around the device, and a flicker of panic darted through his eyes. "They're here," he muttered, almost to himself. "Who?" Devon asked. Richard ignored him, shoving the phone into his pocket. He looked at me with forced calm. "Vivian, we'll discuss this privately." His words carried the brittle edge of a man losing ground but still trying to dictate the terms. I shook my head, steady now in a way I hadn't been all morning. "No, this ends here." The silence that followed was no longer fear, it was anticipation. The collective inhale before a collapse. The boardroom doors swung open with a force that silenced even Richard. 2 men and a woman in dark suits strode inside, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Their movements were crisp, precise, leaving no room for argument. Richard Blackwell, the lead agent, asked. Richard stiffened. "This is a private meeting. You have no authority here." The agent didn't flinch. "Fraud across state lines gives us every authority we need. You'll come with us." The color drained from his face, but he recovered just enough to snarl. "This is outrageous. My lawyers will bury you." They flanked him before he could take another step. One agent guiding him firmly toward the door. His voice grew more frantic as he realized no one in the room was moving to stop them. "She set me up. You think this little whistleblower will save you? Nobody hires a whistleblower." His words spat like poison, meant for me and only me. I gripped the arms of my chair so tightly, my knuckles ached. My body trembled with the aftershock of it all. He was gone, but his venom clung to me. I had saved myself. Yes, but what if he was right? What if the world saw me as damaged goods now, a liability to be avoided? The agents marched him down the corridor. The heavy doors closed, leaving the boardroom in a stunned hush. In the days that followed, the company unraveled. Emergency meetings stacked one after another, auditors swarming every floor. Whispers filled the halls. Senior executives resigned suddenly for personal reasons. Projects stalled. Client calls went unanswered. Deadlines slipped into oblivion. The empire Richard had built was cracking from the inside, and I was standing in the middle of the ruins. Our 12-person team was disbanded, each of us placed on paid leave until the chaos settled. One by one, I watched them clear out their desks, some relieved, others bitter. I carried home a box of files and framed photos that suddenly felt like relics of a different life. That first night sitting alone in my apartment, the silence was unbearable. My phone stayed dark, no calls, no texts. Fear gnawed at me as Richard's words replayed in my head. What if nobody ever trusted me again? What if my career had ended in that boardroom I stared at the ceiling until morning, waiting for something, anything that might tell me this wasn't the end? 3 weeks later, the summons arrived. A crisp email with no subject line, just a time and place, the executive boardroom. My stomach tightened as I read it. I'd spent those weeks drifting in uncertainty. My apartment littered with job postings I couldn't bring myself to apply for. Now, they wanted me back. When I entered, 7 board members sat in a semicircle beneath the glow of recessed lights. Their faces were masks of composure, but I caught the fatigue in their eyes. Diane Mercer, the chairwoman, gestured for me to sit. "Ms. Hartman," she began, her tone clinical. "Our investigation has revealed Mr. Blackwell was not acting alone." 7 executives were complicit. The $23 million he accused your team of stealing was only the surface. We need to rebuild trust, both internally and externally. I waited, letting the silence expand until Lawrence Chen, their general counsel, leaned forward. We'd like you to lead a new compliance division, report directly to us, substantial salary increase, full authority to design your own systems. For a moment, I absorbed the offer. A month ago, I would have grabbed at it, desperate for validation, but the version of me sitting here had been burned and remade. I wasn't about to let them use me as a shield without conditions. I'll consider it, I said evenly, but I have terms. Brows lifted, Diane nodded once. Go on. First, public exoneration for my entire team. A company-wide communication making it clear we were innocent, plus bonuses for the stress they endured. Lawrence scribbled notes. Reasonable. Second, complete hiring control. Anyone in finance who stays will answer to me. Murmurs, reluctant nods. Third, I continued, locking eyes with Diane. Richard's office. I want the corner. That broke their composure. Martin from HR shifted uncomfortably. That's not standard for a director-level position. Nothing about this situation is standard, I replied. Silence stretched. Then Diane inclined her head slowly. Anything else? Yes. I leaned forward, my voice firm. No NDA. I won't disparage the company if you act in good faith, but I won't sign away my right to speak. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Diane tapped her pen against the table. We accept. By the time I left, their signatures were on paper, and for the first time, I realized they needed my integrity more than I needed their power. News of Richard's arrest spread faster than any press release the company had ever issued. Images of him in handcuffs, head bowed, dominated the business channels for days. When the sentencing came months later, 8 years in federal prison, I read the headlines in silence. There was no satisfaction in it, only a strange heaviness. Justice had been served, but nothing could restore the years I had spent erasing myself to protect men like him. The first morning I unlocked Richard's corner office. I hesitated at the threshold. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the desk where he had once plotted my downfall. I traced my hand along the polished surface, and instead of triumph, I felt the weight of every sacrifice that had carried me here. Nights spent alone, friendships abandoned, the hollow echo of my mother's funeral service without me present. The view was dazzling, but it came at a cost. Still, rebuilding left no time for sentiment. I chose allies carefully. Lucia became my deputy, her quiet intuition now guiding the division. Terrence built new security protocols from the ground up, firewalls woven tighter than spider silk. Amara took over communications, her empathy transforming suspicion into trust with clients. Even Dominic, contrite and uncharacteristically humble, earned a second chance. He showed up early, stayed late, and for once let his work speak louder than his pride. A year later, we gathered in the same boardroom where Richard had condemned me. This time, the faces around the table glowed with resolve, not suspicion. I stood at the head and let my eyes rest on each of them. You could have left, I told them, my voice steady. You could have walked away and found safer jobs. Instead, you stayed. You stayed to fix what was broken. And because of that, we built something stronger than what came before. Lucia smiled. Terrence nodded. Amara blinked back tears. Dominic lowered his head in something close to gratitude. I looked out the glass wall at the city sprawling below. Richard had been right about one thing. It is always the quiet ones. Not because we're guilty, but because we notice, we document. We endure, and when the silence finally breaks, we change everything. Isn't the real question not whether the quiet ones are dangerous, but how long they'll stay silent before they finally speak?